Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you for coming. The first thing I should try and remember to tell you is that these slides are only tangentially related to what I'm going to talk to you about. They're just there to give you something else to look at, and if you get bored or you think, what on earth is he going on about, you don't have to look at me at least, you can look at them, or you can of course walk out. It's a free country at the moment. I've been given the title, The Changing Face of Modern Britain. So what I'm going to do is just tell you, I think for about 40 minutes, some aspects of Britain that I think how it's changing in various ways from my point of view. I'll try to err towards things that you might find controversial or not necessarily believe, rather than stuff that is sort of more easily provable perhaps, to make it more interesting. And then I'll end up talking about, if you happen to agree with part of what I'm saying, what then do you do about it? What should we be doing in this country? So it's a fairly wide-ranging talk. The psychological kind of crutch for me is I've looked at lots of numbers over many years and drawn lots of graphs. So it's not just me saying these things off the top of my head, although I'm quite capable of that. I'm quite capable of just thinking, oh, surely it must just be like that. So let's just talk about Britain, how it's portrayed, how it's changing. And I'll just start off with the news. Things in the news very recently. The most recent thing, on a very basic level, is the announcement by ONS that we just had a very big population surge. I think it was yesterday, or the day before. Population is rising rapidly. Now, what I want to start by saying is, A, this may well not be happening, and I'll tell you why, and B, if it is happening, it may well not be a problem. And I'm going to get on to urban design, I promise you, towards the end about these issues. The reason why the population surge that was announced yesterday may not be happening is that ONS, and before them OPCS, have a track record on this. About the year before the censuses are released, at least the 2001 census and the 1991 census, a population estimate for the country is released, which tends to be about 1 million too high. We find out when the census is analysed that there are actually fewer people here, and the reason is fairly simple. We're not very good at counting people when they leave. People particularly tend to leave during recessions or to emigrate to try to find jobs. Often they don't know they're doing that. They think they're going on the summer holiday in a gap year, but can't find a university place and then end up getting a job. So there's a chance that the population isn't rising as much as we think. However, what's unusual about the latest rise is that half of it we can be fairly sure of, because half of it's made up of babies and less dead people. We're quite good at counting babies, much better at counting babies than immigrants, and we're quite good at counting people dying. Not brilliant, because if you go abroad and die, we don't count you. And lots of people now go abroad in retirement. But we're not bad. The baby surge is interesting. I won't bore you about it, except to say, if you follow your baby booms through, we were due a little one now. They've been widening in the length of time that they take. There's currently a little worldwide baby boom going on. It's fairly small, but was big enough to cause the UN about a month ago to change the entire world projection of the population of the planet to say that by the end of the century it'll be 10 billion. Before, it was going to stabilise at around about 9.5 billion. Just tiny little baby booms can have quite big effects. Anyway, that's the population surge at the moment in Britain, and I'm going to talk quite a lot about people, are there too many, and so on. But my feeling about population is that the numbers really are not crucial. The numbers of people that we have are not the determining issue as far as our quality of life is concerned. To put it really crudely, we have about 1% of the adults in the world, and we have about 0.5% of the children. That's the share that we currently have. Where we are unusual is that our population tends to move around a lot more. So we tend to commute more, we tend to go greater distances to schools than, say, most people in Western Europe. We more often have more than one job. More often, two of us in the households have jobs, so we're both trying to get to the jobs. We're quite likely to live far away from our work, and we've been moving further away from where we work. So this all gets to urban design. The issue is not so much the numbers of people as the number of people miles. What you have a problem with in a country or in a city isn't necessarily how many people you're trying to fit in, but how many miles all these people are trying to travel every day. If you have a lot of people trying to travel a lot of miles, you end up with congestion. If you have a lot of people not moving around as much, things work. Or if you have a smaller number of people moving around a lot, things work. Our mobility is unusually high, and I'll try and get to why it's high in a minute, or why I think it's high in a minute. There were practical things, like the building of motorways in the 1980s that increased the potential to move around and so on. And historical things. So we have a history of suburbs, and you move out from London, but you come into work and so on. But it's increased, it's gone up in recent years. How are the British changing, and in what other ways are they changing? The answer that people almost always give when you say how's Britain changing is that the nature of who the British are is changing. Immigration has been going up. The proportion of people born in another country has been going up, particularly in London. At exactly the same time, and by, as far as we can tell, exactly the same amount, the number of emigrants, that's people born in Britain still alive but living somewhere else, has gone up by the same number. So everywhere in the world you have this issue of there's this problem of these people. There's a lovely quote about chain immigration where the Germans complain about the Poles and the Poles complain about the Ukrainians and the Ukrainians complain about people coming in from Azerbaijan and so on. And at the same time, of course, people complain about the reverse migration. The Spanish complain about the British, and we all complain about each other because we want something to complain about. I'm trying to develop a repertoire. It isn't going too well at the moment. I might try it with you because it's very boring just hearing my voice. Of blaming immigration. I think it's very easy to blame immigration. So what I want you to do is to give me, now don't try and be too clever at first, but give me a social problem. Just shout one out and I'll see if I can do it. Any social problem?
Lack of integration.
Okay, lack of integration. Unemployment we had first, then unemployment where they're taking all the jobs. Okay, that's an easy one. Lack of integration, they don't know our customs and cultures, and whereas, of course, we merry men of England all integrated terribly well beforehand. Another social problem?
Child poverty.
Child poverty. If we didn't have immigrants, then our working class would all have jobs, we wouldn't have child poverty, and also you're getting poor immigrants coming, bringing their poverty with them from poor countries. It's terrible. It's so easy, but I know you've got to catch me up. The one I can't answer is why Sheffield Wednesday do so bad at football, and blaming that on. That's why I got stuck last time. But try a few more.
They can't buy foreign football.
They can, yes.
Obesity.
Obesity, immigration and obesity. Ooh, that's a good one. Oh, the foreign muck, food, curries. What is it that's making us fat? In the good old days, when we just ate fish and chips, we got thinner. Yeah. So obesity, and you could draw a graph, couldn't you? Number of foreigners, amount of obesity, look straight line. Go on, I'm on a roll.
Climate change.
Climate change. Yeah, because they're flying. I mean, they want to go home, see mum and dad, and, you know, it's not sustainable. People won't Skype everywhere. Teenage pregnancy and immigration. Ooh, that is quite, well, there is the old nasty stuff. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the 1970s, just old enough to remember these black Caribbean men are impregnating our white girls and stuff. And you have similar again with Asian men going on right now. Go on a couple more and then I'll get off this.
Antisocial behaviour.
Antisocial behaviour. Not fitting in, people going away. If you take somebody out of a nice village structure in Bangladesh or Pakistan where everything works in a feudal kind of way and bring them over here, of course you'll get antisocial behaviour. It's not the immigrants' fault, but it'd be better if they didn't come in the first. I mean, you can see part of me longs to be a bigot. And I wish I had... Now, shall I... Go on and say what...
Which paper do you work for?
I don't... It's easy. It's really, really easy to blame immigration for almost any problem. And that's partly because I think some of the reasons why we do have problems in a lot of these areas are just a little, not much, but just a little bit harder to appreciate. But just enough harder to appreciate so that you can blame lack of cohesion, multiculturalism and immigration for them. Libels. I've got a list of about 4 libels I want to give you. It's just pure statistical libels. Foreigners are taking every new job. I mean, they think you're really stupid when they tell you that one. I mean, just think about it for a second. Do you think nobody born in Britain has got themselves a new job in the last couple of years? Do you think that's actually occurred? That's what it sounds like. I think, was it Ian Duncan Smith today peddling this one? He really thinks you're stupid. I do worry that Ian might not quite be up to understanding why it's a lie either, but I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and say he's clever, in which case he's disingenuous. The foreigners take every job libel is just playing with nets. And there's always this thing of playing with nets. It's not playing with an actual quantity, it's taking away one quantity another. So you take the number of new jobs, that is people losing jobs and people gaining jobs, and you get a difference, which is no longer a real number. It's not actually something where you can pick somebody up and hold them up and wave them. It's not like babies, which are real, or dead people, which are real. It's a net, which is different, which is like a net migrant. And you can compare that number of the change in jobs to the number of people who've come in from abroad and got a job, and then you say they've taken all the jobs. But for it to be true, not a single person in Britain should have managed to have got a job. Now, I know quite a few people in Britain who've actually, it's very hard getting a job now, but there are jobs, and they get them. It's just a pure, simple, little statistical trick. Other libels. There's a great libel on the poor going on at the moment. There's a tradition of libelling the poor, which is saying things about the poor which simply aren't true. The libel which is being resurrected at the moment in Britain is the idea of intergenerational poverty. The poor pass on their poorness somehow, and you've got to crack it. 3 generations of workless households. I defy you to find a statistic where that one came from. Absolutely made up. As far as we can tell, this talk of there are lots of households where 3 generations have never worked, somebody just decided to say that one day. And so part of what's going on in Britain is that people are accepting statements being made with absolutely no basis for it. Money doesn't solve poverty. Well, it's actually quite good. I mean, if you ask somebody who's poor what it is they're lacking, and I won't dig myself into a hole, I could dig myself into a hole, too many go to university. Now, it depends what universities are and what you think about them as being, but people said similar things about secondary education in the 1930s. What do I think is going on? Because I don't want to go over my time. I do want to have a debate with you, and I hope I'm riling some of you a bit to get a debate and get myself put in my place a bit. What's been going on, and been going on for a long time now, since probably at least around about 1973-74, slowly at first, faster in the 80s, a bit slow at the start of the 90s, faster in the middle of the 90s, slowed down a bit, some early Labour budgets, 2002-03, but then accelerated again 2005-06, and is now going on with abundance. What's been going on since the 70s is, on average, if you put people into groups by income or wealth, then the group which has done the best have been those at the top. They've seen their incomes rise faster. They've seen their wealth rise even faster. The next group have done the next best. There's been a little bit of movement between these groups, but that's tended to slow down. The next group has done next best. The middle hasn't done particularly well, but was doing okay. And the bottom, well, it, for most of the 1980s, hardly saw any increase at all in its income did see a bit of increase in its wealth. The wealth at the bottom went up from 3% to 4% at one point when Right to Buy was enacted. That was actually a wealth transfer. Not saying whether I'm in favour of it or not, just saying when we count these things, you suddenly notice things like that and go, what on earth's happened there? And it takes you some time to work out. But that's all been lost now. So you've had this stretching out. The stretching out has got most acute this year. This year, for the first time, at least for 50 or 60 years in Britain, we've actually seen the middle going down in real terms, ever so slightly. This had been happening for years in the US, but not in Europe until now. So if you're an average person in Britain, your standard of living is beginning to drop. But at the very top, the richest 1,000 people last year had a 29% increase in their wealth. This year, a 25% increase in wealth. That's an income of at least 60 million. That's zooming up. The top 1% have been paying bonuses again and getting other cachet again. So the top 1% has been going up quite fast. The top 10%, as far as we can see, are doing okay. Nobody's threatening to take GPs' pension schemes away from them. Even though GPs are paid by the public purse, they quite cleverly, rather like university professors, have a private pension scheme which can't be touched. Anyway, top 10% doing okay. Not as well as the top 1%, which is why GPs moan about their salaries. And top 1% aren't doing that well compared to the super rich, which is why they can't afford to buy a house where their parents used to. But they're doing okay. But you've noticed I've missed out 90% of the population. Below them, you have this stretching out, so the middle person feels squeezed now, but they don't have to feel too bad. Again, let me put my bigot hat. I wish I had this hat on when I said bigot. They don't have to feel too bad if you're in the middle. Things aren't too bad, because your mortgage is nice and cheap, isn't it? And we're keeping your mortgage cheap for you, because we care about you. When you hear ministers talking like that, what you have to remember, and it makes a lot of sense as soon as you remember this, is that some government ministers see keeping mortgage interest rates low as a way in which they help the poor, because they would never get a mortgage because they have enough money to buy outright. But some people have to borrow to buy a house, and they are poorer people than them. Now, of course, if you know the numbers, you'll know mortgage holders are in the middle of society. They're not the rich or the poor. But although mortgage payments may have not gone up, incomes aren't going up, inflation is going up, people are actually being squeezed. But we're going to make you feel all right, because we're going to kick the people beneath you more. We'll take away their scrounging benefits. We'll stop them getting their nice gold-plated public sector pensions and so on. And so you can feel better in the middle, even if your living standards is falling, because it's going to rise compared to those beneath you. Just don't look up. It'll rise. And if you go down, benefits are being either frozen or cut. However, if you're on the benefit and keeping your benefit, you're doing okay, because compared to somebody, say, who was getting disability benefit for mental illness, is now found to no longer qualify for that and is going to appeal, takes about 6 months, they will be on reduced income support. CAB and Gateshead have recently worked out that works out a day after rent, gas bills, TV licence, to about £2.30 a day to live on, which is for food, clothes, soap, and so on. So we've actually reduced people down to probably below the breadline at the bottom. So there's been a stretching out. Now, it's been going on for 30 or 40 years. For the vast majority of those 30 or 40 years, the gap was getting bigger relatively, but the poor were still getting something. And in some years, it was going up a little bit more than others, even if the people above you were going up much faster. It's only very recently that we've actually seen real drops at the bottom, which becomes harder to sell. It becomes harder to say to people, the country as a whole is becoming poorer, but it's still fine for the top to get richer. And one way you sell it is by stretching that thing out. What happens when you do this? And I'll go back and talk about the slow and decade after decade thing, as well as what's happened most recently, which is extreme. People get used to it. I mean, it is all my it's all my adult life, and a large chunk of my childhood is this. That this is just normality. That is what the world is like. As long as it doesn't radically alter that much year on year, you're used to it. And you don't begin to notice that you're spending a higher proportion of your money on housing every year, higher than your parents spent. And you're spending the money on housing, not because the housing is wonderfully different to the housing that your parents lived in. You're spending it because the key element in the price of the housing is how much you're spending to live away from those other people whose incomes are moving away from yours, who you don't want your children to go out with, who you'd rather not go to the same school and so on. The same process has been documented in America in great detail, where just to be able to send your child to an average school in America now costs far, far more in terms of housing price as a proportion of income than it costs people's parents. Similarly, you end up with long commutes to work because you want to move away from the areas where you don't want to be a resident, but the work is still there. We have workplaces that bring together people on very different incomes. So if you have people on very different incomes moving apart from each other and income distributions moving apart, you've still got to end up getting them into the same place. It's like we're molecules, and the force of repellence between us has been slowly ratcheted up, and it becomes harder to organise when that happens. Let me zoom on towards the end of this. My view of what's happened in the last 2 years, particularly the crash of 2008, is that the party's ended. We could partly get away with this kind of ever-increasing inequality, and in a similar way to the United States got away with it, by saying, well, living standards are actually going up at the bottom slightly. Well, in aggregate, over 30 years, much more than slightly. I mean, people will be able to heat their homes who were in the poorest tenth of society by the end of this, whereas if you go back to the 1950s, the middle class weren't heating their homes. So while we had economic growth, or to put it more honestly, while more of the world's money was flooding into this country, you could sell widening inequality on the grounds that the bottom at least isn't going down, and the rich were fine as long as they only paid their taxes, and maybe we should just try to work that out. That ends as a valid argument once you get what has happened now, unless you tell people, don't worry, we'll bounce back very quickly. It'll soon be like 2005 again. I don't think it is going to do that. I can tell you why, if you want to know, but I think there basically is no recovery going on at the moment. And it's a matter of time before people realise there's no recovery, in a similar way to there was no recovery really in the 1930s. And people realised, I mean, in America they realised by 1933 there was no recovery, and they did different things about it. And those things had a lot of effect before the war. But again, I won't bore you with that. What should we try to do if this is the case? We've been living through this for 30 or 40 years. We've become very, very separated from each other, and we've become poorer. Got 4 things I think we should try and do, and then I'll sum up. The first thing we should do is consolidate what we have. This is a very, very rich country in a very different situation from the last time we had a major financial crisis, which was 1929. But by the things we have, it's not just, we do actually have a bit of wealth in this country, so we could use some of that wealth. Most of it's locked up in, most of it that you can get is locked up in land, and there are ways of getting that. But simple things like sewers. We have a very expensive sewer system that we built over a large number of years. We were able to do it because we took a lot of money out of places like India and made it possible for us to build over Victorian sewers first. But we have this sewer system. There's a lot more infrastructure than sewers, but sewers are my favourite bit of infrastructure. How do you consolidate the sewers? Well, what you do is you decide that you want to use the built environment where it currently is, if at all possible. Which means when you have a housing market crash, which we're having in some parts of the country, you do not demolish streets of houses to try to stop the bottom price not being zero, which is what people did the last time we had houses going down. They demolished in large numbers. You also do not decide you want to build large amounts of housing and other things down here, which requires new infrastructure to be built. You consolidate what you already have. Part of the reason for doing that is that 1% of old adults and 0.5% of old children. We have far more sewers per head than most of the world simply doesn't have sewer systems. So I think part of what we should be thinking about is how do we use our sewer systems for greater good, but I'll move on. Secondly, in consolidation, linking. I'm in favour of linking our cities better. I think I'm in favour of high-speed rail. Again, it consolidates what we've had, rather than saying we build and build and build and make London bigger and let the north go. Thirdly, we need to encourage people to have only one home. We currently have, as far as I can work out, more housing per head than we've ever had in this country. We've got more bedrooms per person than we've ever had. Lots of people don't think of their second home as a second home. They think of it as the convenient flat in the city, or they think of it as, well, that was my house and that was her house and then we got together, but you know, these aren't second homes, they're our houses, it's just we happen to live in one of them now, and so on and so on. We've found various ways to make ourselves think that we're not second homeowners, those of us who are, but it is very inefficient. So you need ways to encourage people not to do it. You similarly need ways to, I'm not saying you should force people, just encourage. It's much better to encourage people than to tell them they can't do something. They get very angry then. Should be great incentives to go to the nearest school. If we simply had a few more people going to the nearest school next year than last year, that is cheaper for all kinds of reasons. Similarly, for going to the nearest university, rather than flooding across the country paying your £9,000 a year fees for the privilege of pretending that I won't dig myself into a hole of it. And thirdly, how many jobs do we each need to do, and does each household need to do? Do we really need all these households with 2 people working full time? And it's men in particular I'm thinking about, not necessarily working, having to think they have to work full time. But it's consolidation. Fourthly, and lastly on this list, we should stop trying to cling on. What we've been doing, I think, in Britain, in many ways for 100 years, and this partly explains why we had that increase in inequality in the 70s, is we found it very hard to lose empire. It's difficult if you were the world's most powerful country to watch yourself slowly slipping down the ranks. But that's always what happens to the world's most powerful country. And the country to learn from is the Dutch, who, you probably won't know it, but they were the world's most powerful country before we were, and they've learned to live with it. Living with not being the world's most powerful country anymore means not having a big military, well, not small, but not behaving in a very odd way. What's the alternative to my sort of semi-delusional utopian gene? Well, we could carry on as we are, that's a possibility, but it's unlikely. We tend to either go up or down. We either become more equal, which we did from the 1920s all the way through to the 1970s, or we become more unequal, which is what we did from the 1970s through to now, and which we're now doing at a faster rate, I think, than at any time before. But it's very unusual circumstances. Because the bottom's going down, absolutely, the top's getting richer. If we carry on getting more unequal, the only parallel I can find, because London is already probably the world's most unequal city by wealth of the rich countries, the only parallel I can find is Singapore. It's a Singapore model, and London becomes like Singapore. How does London become like Singapore? Well, you need to expel the poor from London, more of the poor, so you change the housing benefit rules to clear poor people out. And you need to change the immigration rules so that you no longer have immigration in the hundreds of thousands but in the tens of thousands, and you only allow guest workers in, like Singapore does, who are sent home if they become pregnant, like Singapore does. And this was suggested by a Conservative MP last year. It's in Hansard, that we have guest workers, not immigrants. London becomes like Singapore, rich, powerful city. You don't actually have to have a physical wall, you can have an invisible wall. It's those housing benefit rules and other rules. And the rest of the country, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales and the north becomes what it makes sense to be, which is just another peripheral European country. Iceland, Ireland, the north, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and then all the way around Eastern Europe. That's the way we're currently heading. I don't think a committee have sat on a yacht and planned for that, but that, to my mind, is the current direction of the trajectory. The reason why we're heading that way is that there's this desperate belief that we can get back to Plan A, that the rest of the world will start flooding money back into the City of London, that they can trickle down and we can carry on as we were before. But it just seems to me very unlikely, and I think we need to begin to plan for being a poorer country as a whole, and how do you become all poorer together in a way that doesn't mean you have a revolution or things suddenly become much better, but in a very similar way to the 20s and the 30s, and to the 40s and the austere 50s as well. Next year, we're ever so slightly more equal to each other than last year. If that goes on for a whole generation, you suddenly find out you wake up one morning and you're in the 1960s, and it's quite interesting and a bit different to before, and then you're in the 1970s, which despite people saying how terrible they were, for most people in Britain, one of the best times to be alive because you were most like other people, you had the highest wages and standards of living that you'd ever had in your history, low debt, and you had a choice of job, and if you didn't like your job, you were free enough to be able to leave it and go and get another one because there were choices back then. I've talked for long enough. I hope that's interesting enough for some people to ask me what they think and why on earth I suggest this. So thank you very much for your patience.